wanted to tell just a little bit of a story about him before we get started. When we started the Rethinking Hell ministry back in 2012, it was shortly after the publication of a book that he co-wrote with Francis Chan. And their book was, I would argue, largely a response to Rob Bell and what, at least at the time, seemed like the universalism that he was promoting. There's some question about whether or not he was actually promoting universalism. But anyway, in that book, they addressed both universalism and conditional immortality, the view that we at Rethinking Hell believe in. But ultimately, they sided with the traditional view, the doctrine of eternal torment, if only slightly. And that was one thing that really impressed us, was they showed an incredible amount of charity and respect and kindness. They covered our view seriously. They didn't dismiss it as plenty of people unfortunately do. They took it seriously, but ultimately they sided with the traditional view. Well, that didn't last for too long, and it wasn't too long before we at Rethinking Hell kind of got our claws in our first speaker here, and eventually, I think over time, helped to convince him that, or at least closely convince him, I don't know, we'll find out when he speaks in a moment, but largely convinced him that maybe there was more to this view that we believe in than they had thought in the book that they published, him and Francis Chan. And since then, he's done a phenomenal job on his podcast and in other places, fielding questions about hell. And he's really become a really good friend of the ministry, and it's been such a joy for me to get to know him personally and to get to meet him. And honestly, again, I don't deserve to share the stage with him or with other speakers, but he probably feels differently. Anyway, I guess that with no further ado, I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then I'll get started. He's authored a number of books, which he's got out at the table out there, including the New York Times bestselling Erasing Hell. That's the book that I was talking about, in case you didn't know, that he co-authored with Francis Chan. He also published Fight, A Christian Case for Nonviolence, Paul and Judaism Revisited, which was published by IVP in 2013, and Charis is how we pronounce it in Hebrew, I think. We English speakers might want to say charis or something like that, but it's charis, which is the word for grace, God's Scandalous Grace for Us, by David C. Cook in 2014. And then most recently, and perhaps most controversially, People to Be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. And I'm appreciative for the work that he's been doing in that area as well. He's been married to Christine for almost 10 years, and together they have 4 children. And of course, I'm talking about Preston Sprinkle. So if you would please put your hands together and welcome Preston Sprinkle to the stage.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. Yeah, I wish I had a better story behind my foot, like I was running from a grizzly bear with, 3 orphans on my shoulders. One of them wasn't even born yet, and I got attacked, but I stepped off a curb and tore every ligament in my foot. So I've been in a boot for like 2 months. So, good. That's working out. This is awesome. This is the first time I've done it like this. So it's, thank you, Chris, for that. And this is kind of an end, not end. This is part of a long journey I've been on with something that probably like everybody in this room, and I would say almost every Christian that I've met, this is a really hard conversation, a hard doctrine. And yet, I imagine you're here because you love Jesus, you love the Bible, and hard doctrines aren't going to scare you away. We, as Christians who love the Bible, we're going to hit them head on and wrestle with what the Bible says about it. And I've been doing that for many years on this topic. And so in a weird way, I'm not a hellfire brimstone kind of guy, but in a weird way, this doctrine has been close to me, and yet it's been a wrestling match for several years. So this is, it's like 6 or 8 months ago when you asked me to come speak at this, and I said, okay, I think I need to figure out where I'm at on this, and this conference will force me to do that, because I'm not going to stand up here and just kind of like, be wishy-washy. I want to figure out where I'm at on this conversation, and so you will be the first to hear that tonight. So I started seminary in the year 2000, actually. It's that long ago. I started seminary, and I remember 1 year into seminary, I can't remember the context, but I just remember hearing like in the hallway conversations that the great John Stott was an annihilationist. John Stott is kind of like, the Tim Keller of UK church theology, incredible pastor, a man of the church, but an incredibly sharp thinker, and brilliant scholar, like a pastor theologian, solid evangelical, scholar, pastor, and I heard he was an annihilationist. And I remember my first response was, oh man, I thought he was a Christian. I was wrestling. I was like, wait a minute, because I was like, and still am very reformed, like you can't lose your salvation. So I'm like, okay, wait a minute, okay. So if you're an annihilationist, you can't be a Christian. So does that mean he lost his salvation? Well, I don't believe that, but does that mean John Stott, that all these years wasn't a Christian? And I remember it was kind of this like, it wasn't a major like dent in my faith, but it was something that caused me to really wrestle, because I came at this question with the assumption that there is one biblical view of hell and all other views are heretical. And if you if you open up the Bible with a view to consider other views, then you're going down what's called the slippery slope towards liberalism. And so I wrestled with really the salvation of John Stott for, a few weeks and kind of moved on after that. Didn't even lay on the table that maybe John Stott might know something more about the Bible than me as a first-year seminary student. Now, that wasn't a category. It wasn't a category because annihilation equals non-biblical. Fast forward exactly 10 years, and Rob Bell publishes his book, Love Wins. And I was teaching at a Bible college called Eternity Bible College, and it was connected to the church where Francis Chan was a pastor at, and the school and college were kind of closely connected. And I had students coming to me and asking me about Love Wins, and so I had to quickly go read it. And I actually really loved the book. In fact, many things about what Rob talked about in Love Wins were things I was talking about. Kind of the focus on the renewal of creation, and it was a really. I say it like this, like a typical Rob, I don't know, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but when I listen to Rob Bell, I'm like 70% spot on. 20%, I'm not sure, and 10%, you'd get burned at the stake for that, like 400 years ago, like there's some blatant heresy there, some really kind of questionable stuff, but a lot of it's like, yeah, this is good, it causes me to think and go back to the text. But when he talked about what the Bible says about hell, I was like, oh man, I just think you're really off here. In fact, Rob Bell's known for being really steeped in the Jewish context of the New Testament. Like that's his shtick, right? Like he preaches from the Jewish context. And I was like, well, wait a minute. You're articulating a very un-Jewish view of hell. And that's my background's in first century Judaism. And I was like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And then that was the first blog I ever wrote was titled, "You Can't Have Your Cake and Eat It Too." It was a response to Rob Bell saying, your view of hell, whether it's right or wrong, is a very un-Jewish view. And Francis Chan was also getting questions about Rob Bell. Long story short, we decided to write a book-length response to Rob Bell. And we really wanted to go back to what does the Bible actually say, because both of us had our assumptions of what hell was, but both of us kind of looked at each other saying, I don't know, I've never really in-depthly studied this. I just assume that he's wrong, but maybe he's right. Maybe he's right. And if he is, then let's support him. But let's write a book and respond to Rob Bell. And it turned out to be more than just a response, but that was, as you said, Chris, that was kind of the trigger that launched the book. And we were given 8 weeks to write that book. And we finished in 7. I don't recommend that speed, but during my research, my first couple weeks and I was spending 18 hours a day, I want to make sure I get this right. And I remember coming across an essay by Earl Ellis, Baptist theologian, New Testament scholar, Earl Ellis, called The New Testament Teaching on Hell. And I remember reading it kind of in a lazy way, like, gosh, if you're a Baptist named Earl, obviously you're going to be biblical. I mean, I don't need to like pay it, so I just kind of reading it like, okay, just tell me where the verses are. And I remember at the end of it, he concluded, on annihilation. And I'm going to use the phrase annihilation because it's popular. I think I actually like the phrase conditionalism, conditional immortality better. But for lack of better terms, I'm just going to use the term annihilation. It's familiar. And he concluded that, and so I went back and read it again, and I remember I was really blown away at the article. one of the things that stands out most in the article is that he pointed out that the most common language used to describe the fate of the wicked is language of destruction. Language of destruction, language that connotes, death or perish or destruction or destroy or whatever, language that would normally give the impression that whatever is being destroyed will no longer live. And I remember looking at these verses and looking them up and double checking. I was like, oh my gosh, he's got something here. I mean, Matthew 10, I remember looking at Matthew 10:28, though, do not fear those who kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather kill him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Clearly the word destroy is correlated with kill. And here it says God will kill or destroy both body and soul in hell. And I was like, I don't know what to do with that. Because I know annihilation is heresy, but I don't know what to do with that verse. Romans 6:23 says the wages of sin is death, but the free gift is eternal life. And since people who have eternal life still physically die on earth, that means that the death in question is something more than just physical earthly death. And I don't know what to do with that. John 3:16. Whosoever believes in him should not perish. I remember reading that verse and thinking, this is John 3:16. I've been a Christian for almost 18 years by that time. I've got a PhD in the New Testament, and I never thought about the word perish in John 3:16. When I give these talks on hell now, I'll read John 3:16 and said, and whosoever believes in him should not, and the crowd says, perish. Like they'd never heard that word before. And I remember reading the article, and I had a lump in my gut for three reasons. Number one, he seemed to be reading these verses pretty correctly. Like it didn't seem, everybody says, annihilationists, they do, interpretive gymnastics. And I'm like, it doesn't feel that way. Like when I read Matthew 20:28, I'm like, it seems like they're just kind of interpreted the way it says. Like John 3:16, perish. I did a little word study on apolumi, and that kind of means perish, or destroy, or be destroyed, or killed, or cessation of life, or whatever. Like maybe it doesn't mean that, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of gymnastics going on here. So I had a lump in my, I was like, maybe he's right. Secondly, I'm like, these are famous verses. I memorized these in Awana. I memorized them in Greek before I knew Greek. And I'm like, how did I know these such famous verses and I never even considered what they actually meant? Do you ever have those moments in evangelicalism in your Christian walk when you're like, how come I never actually considered what these words actually mean? Third reason why I had a lump in my stomach, I was like, crap, what do we do now? We got this book we're going to turn in with an evangelical publisher, and now I'm like, oh my word, I just assumed we were going to see eternal conscious torment. Now I'm seeing some other things that might challenge that. So I talked to Francis, and I remember calling him and saying, hey, what are your non-negotiables about this book we're writing, And he's like, well, this, that, biblical authority, eternal conscious torment, all this stuff. And I go, well, hold on a second. That ECT thing, eternal conscious torment, I said, what about, and I kind of gave him some pushbacks that I found from Ellis, and he's like, wow. And he is a staunch biblicist, whether you think that's a good thing or bad thing, he's really wanting to go where the text leads. And he's like, well, I never even considered that. I said, me neither. And he said, well, we need to go where the text leads. Our allegiance is not to a publisher, it's not to a book, not to tradition. It's where the text leads. So if the text either isn't that clear, or if it says annihilation, we need to go where the text leads. I said, okay, let's do it. And I remember racing quickly to a lot of the kind of what about this, what about that passages. I mean, some of the common phrases we hear about hell. Well, what about weeping and gnashing of teeth? We see this throughout the New Testament. And so I said, okay, weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's clearly talking eternal conscious torment. But then I did, a bit of just a real basic cross-reference on that phrase, and I found out that in the biblical usage, gnashing of teeth doesn't mean pain. It means resistance, stubbornness, anger. In fact, Psalm 112 says, the wicked man will see and be vexed. He will gnash his teeth and will waste away. The longings of the wicked will come to nothing. Here, wasting away, coming to nothing, is actually on the heels of gnashing of teeth. And plus, the Bible doesn't say that we'll gnash their teeth forever and ever and ever. It just says they'll gnash their teeth. And I sat back and said, well, wait a minute. Okay, so there's nothing in the phrase gnashing of teeth that intrinsically demands eternal conscious torment. The phrase just means resistance, that when people are cast into hell, they will be holding on to their sin. There's a story about a Baptist preacher, an Irish preacher named Ian Paisley, who was preaching a sermon on the end times, and he was getting real fired. This is a real fiery Irish preacher. He got to the point about the day of judgment, and he said, and in the day of judgment, there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And a woman in the front row says, Dr. Paisley, I don't have any teeth. And he said, teeth will be provided. That's my transition. What about unquenchable fire? Surely unquenchable fire demands never-ending torment. I mean, after all, Jesus says, his winnowing fork in his hands. He will clear the threshing floor, gather the wheat into the barn, and burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. Surely unquenchable fire demands suffering forever and ever and ever in hell. But if you do, again, a quick kind of cross-reference, you see that this is it's a stock Old Testament image, not for eternal conscious torment, but for a fire that is so powerful, so robust, it destroys everything in its path. In fact, look at the very language of Jesus' own words. I mean, he specifically uses a Greek word that means burn up. And if you throw chaff into a really, really fire that you can't put out, it's so powerful you can't squirt it out with a hose, what does the chaff do in that fire? The real straightforward basic metaphor means to burn up, consume, not to torment forever and ever. Okay, but what about the phrase eternal fire? Surely eternal fire means that people are going to burn forever and ever in hell. And I will say that it could mean that. It's only used 3 times in the New Testament, Matthew 18, 25, and Jude 7. Now, by this time, I had taken several years of Greek, had spent many years studying the Greek New Testament, and any second, maybe third-year Greek student knows that the word eternal the English word eternal or everlasting is it might capture what aionios, the Greek word, means, but the Greek word aionios is a little more complicated than that. It could mean a never-ending time. It could mean a period of time, as it's used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Hebrew equivalent, olam, means it can mean all kinds of different things. So I knew there was complications about the word everlasting or eternal, and plus the word eternal could highlight the temporal everlastingness, or it could highlight the quality, or it could highlight both. All that to say, we can't just assume everlasting just means never-ending torment when it's connected with fire, and plus it's connected with the fire. It doesn't actually say that they will be being punished by the fire forever and ever and ever. Maybe that's what it means, but the phrase itself doesn't intrinsically mean that. In fact, if you look at a parallel passage, or not a parallel, just one of the usages in the New Testament, we see that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, okay, this is Genesis 18 and 19, where they indulged in sexual immorality, pursued strange flesh, and they serve as an example, undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Whatever eternal fire means, Jude is saying that is what happened to Sodom. Now, I've been to Sodom, literally, and it's not still on fire. So whatever the phrase means, it cannot mean never-ending fire, and it certainly doesn't necessarily mean never-ending burning, but not quite consuming forever and ever and ever. Maybe the phrase can be used that way, but the phrase itself doesn't mean that. In fact, if you look at other references to eternal fire in and around the New Testament, by the way, I'm going to put the references to like early Jewish or intertestamental Jewish texts up here. And if this is unfamiliar, I'm not trying to be top down or like, oh, everybody's been reading, Testament of Zebulun or 1QS or whatever. It's just that I have Craig Evans sitting up here and he's got these texts memorized, so he's going to be checking my stuff. So I just need to make sure. So I'm putting it, if you're not aware of it, just know these are intertestamental Jewish references. That is the world of the New New Testament. We'll look inside how are these phrases used outside the New Testament. And we see in other Jewish texts parallel to the New Testament that eternal fire here is correlated with destroying. In Testament of Zebulun or in 1QS, this is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the context of destruction, talks about the gloom of everlasting fire. There is one reference in 2 Maccabees 12 where it says, justice has laid up for you intense and eternal fire and tortures, and these throughout all time. That's up there. Will never let you go. This is talking about eternal conscious torment. 4 Maccabees 12. But we know that from the context. We know it because he says tortures that will never let you go. The phrase itself, eternal fire, doesn't demand eternal conscious torment. It may be used that way, but we know that from the surrounding context. And yet in the New Testament, there's nothing in the surrounding context that demands the phrase itself means everlasting torment. What about just the word hell, Gehenna, used 12 times in the New Testament, mostly in the Gospels? Well, the background of the term Gehenna, where we get our word hell from, is indisputably from Jeremiah 7, where it says that the days are coming when no longer will you call it the valley of the son of Hinnom. That's kind of the background of Gehenna. But the valley of slaughter, for they will bury in Topheth because the dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds. The very origin of the word Gehenna or hell talks about I won't say it. I'll try not to say annihilation. A slaughter, a destruction, a time when God will end the life of those who have rebelled against him. And I go, okay, well, that's the background. Well, what does this word mean in the first century? Well, if you look at all the different references to Gehenna in Jewish sources that surround the New Testament, you have a pretty wide array of different meanings. I mean, sometimes we just don't know. It just says Gehenna, and we're not sure exactly whether it's eternal conscious torment or annihilation. Sometimes it does probably refer to eternal conscious torment, and I actually just double-checked some of these, and that's why you see question marks up there, because I'm like, actually, I don't, after double-checking, it's not that clear. We do see torment, punishing for a little bit, and then annihilation. We also see annihilation. We even see ultimate reconciliation. And all the universalists in the room said, amen. All right, there's one of you. It's a late reference, though, so you don't have much to go on here. Third Enoch is really late. In fact, all of these references are post AD 70. These are all later than the New Testament, or at least later than the specific time of Jesus. So all that to say, the word Gehenna or the word hell, the biblical word for hell, does not demand either annihilation, ECT, whatever. It just means the place of punishment. And in its original context, if you were Jeremiah and you wanted to define Gehenna, you would say annihilation. It's just a time when God will come and end the lives of the wicked. So here I am. You can imagine my stress. I mean, here I am wrestling with all these things. But then I realized, you know what? The main question in the book of Erasing Hell was not really annihilation versus eternal conscious torment. The main question was, does hell exist? Is it a place of punishment, kind of like an afterlife punishment, and is it reversible? Because in Bell's book, does hell exist? Yeah, hell exists. I mean, we have genocides, we have sexual abuse, we have poverty, and very this worldly. And I'm like, yeah, we do have those things, and those are kind of hellish, but that's not what Gehenna means in the New Testament. It was kind of our main kind of thing. Like, no, there is a hell, and wait a minute, once you go there, can you come out of there? And we found that no, we don't think the biblical evidence supports the so-called universalist position. So really, whether annihilation or ECT wasn't really our main point, and so we spent about 2 pages, maybe 3, talking about the annihilation versus ECT, and we said the debate about hell's duration is much more complex than I first assumed. While I lean heavily on the side that says it's everlasting, I'm not ready to claim that with complete certainty. Now, I don't know if I would have said that. I mean, it was dually authored. I think I said like we lean towards this, but dual author, you got to kind of give and take. I'm like, okay, I guess heavily, sure, I can go with that. I can go with that. But that wasn't. I wouldn't say that was my choice language. But we did lean there. Just to clear this up for the people in this room, I get this all the time. Wait, you wrote that book that you don't agree with anymore. And I was like, well, I still agree with about 98.5% of it. Because the duration, whether hell is, annihilation or ECT was not the main point. We spent a couple pages kind of leaning heavily towards ECT. But no, yes. I mean, I'm selling it out there. I think I have one copy left. It still represents 98% of what I still believe. So why did we lean heavily towards eternal conscious torment? Really, it was the so-called big three. This is the three passages that come up. I was just rereading Don Carson's critique of annihilation on the airplane today, and these are the big three he brought up too. I didn't even know that, but he brought up the same ones that I came to. Revelation 20. 14, 9 through 11, and 25, verse 46. That one's probably maybe the most, well, these are all pretty well known, but Matthew 25, these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into everlasting life. And so I just assume, well, gosh, I mean, life is everlasting forever, so the punishment must be. I mean, it says everlasting punishment, so that supports eternal conscious torment. And then the other passages, I still to this day think that Revelation 14, verse 11 is probably the strongest. I actually no longer think Matthew 25 has much of a case, as hopefully we'll see if we have time. But these are the ones I'm like, okay, here is a solid case for ECT, and we're going to lean towards that. So published a book, got a ton of critiques. I had a lot of phone calls from universalists and annihilationists. I mean, I spent hours and hours talking to people, doing interviews, and convince you this way, because it was kind of we were very open and I think fairly honest with the text, and I'll never forget getting a email. Maybe it was a phone call. No, I think an email at that time from a guy who said, "Hey, you should be on a podcast with Chris Date." And I said, "Well, who's Chris Date?" And so I Googled Chris Date and did a little bit of research and realized, like, yeah, I can do this podcast. I mean, was this guy, oh, he's an annihilationist? I'm like, all right, well, where's he a professor at? Oh, he's a software engineer? I'm like, okay, so sure, yeah, I'll do the podcast, wipe the floor with him, and I didn't know who he was, I mean, he's an annihilationist, so I was like, I don't even know if he's a Christian, I mean, I'm gonna, and I waltzed into that interview very unprepared. Chris was very gracious. In fact, I re-listened to the first episode, and you're so gracious. The second episode, not too much. I think you started to pull out your big guns there, but I remember he started throwing all these questions at me, and I was like, I don't know about that. Well, what about this? Haven't thought about that. What about that? Let me think about that. What about this Greek word? And he's like pronouncing Greek words correctly. He doesn't know Greek. Yeah, I told someone that today. I was like, before you even now you know Greek, but I mean, you were actually, I'm like, I thought this guy didn't know what he's talking about. I thought I was just going to win the argument. Here he is just like, wow. And so it sent me back to the drawing board again and said, okay, I got to figure this out. And so that was 2012, and I've been on a journey since then, trying to figure out what does the Bible actually say about the nature of hell. I'm convinced that there's a hell. It's an afterlife punishment. I'm convinced that it's irreversible. But I had questions about the nature of the punishment. And after looking up words, after studying, after looking at passages, after talking with Chris several times, and being after several other podcasts, and talking with other people and giving talks on this and looking at different passages and doing extensive word studies. Because I'm a huge fan of the Bible. When I got saved, somebody told me that the God who breathed stars into existence also breathed out his word. And I fell in love with studying the Bible almost overnight when I became a Christian, and I can't get enough of it. And I am committed, 24 years in studying the Bible and spending most of my 40 to 60 hour weeks studying the Bible, learning the languages, studying the context, going where the text leads because God breathed out this word, and we should follow him where the text leads. At all costs, even if it leads you to disagree with your church's doctrinal statement. My allegiance is not to a doctrinal statement. My allegiance, I'm not Catholic, and no offense if you are, but my allegiance is to the Bible, not to some sort of papal authority or papal-ish kind of authority that says, well, here's what we believe, don't you dare question this. No, I'm going to go where the text leads because God breathed stars into existence. He also breathed out his word, and having done that, having looked at as much as I can, and I'm still on a journey. I'm still willing to be corrected, but after looking at all the evidence, I am very, very convinced that the so-called annihilation position is the best representation of what the whole Bible says about the future state of the wicked. I'm going to race through a bunch of stuff, and that clock's my biggest enemy right now, but don't try to take notes. We will get the PowerPoint slides to you, my notes even, whatever. Just I'm going to go fast. I'm not going to probably read everything. But I'm going to be totally honest. I want to overwhelm you with the Bible. So if you love the Bible, I don't want you to walk through those doors tonight, at least saying, I need to go back and study this. That's my goal. That's my goal. If you say, oh, no, your view is not biblical, then I'm going to say there's some wires that are like misfiring or something. So I'm going to overwhelm you with the Bible tonight, okay? So don't try to write it all down. Let's go to the Old Testament. This is where a lot of people, when they look at the doctrine of hell, they go to the Old Testament and say the Old Testament doesn't say much about it. Daniel Block, one of my favorite Old Testament scholars, says, what does the Old Testament teach about hell? The simple answer is very little. And then he does some word studies on Sheol or some references where there may be some post-death existence from the wicked, Ezekiel 32, maybe Daniel 12 and other passages. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not the question. The question isn't what happens immediately after death. The question is, what is the ultimate fate of the wicked? What does God's final triumph over evil look like? Ask that question, then go to the Old Testament, and you're going to have a whole treasure chest full of passages to look at. What is God's ultimate and final response to wickedness and the wicked? That's the term that the Bible uses, the wicked, those who deny believing in God. And so when we do this, I think the Old Testament says a lot. So sometimes there's general statements about God's judgment on the wicked. These may be, sometime in the near future. Maybe they're this earthly judgment. Maybe they're more distant. If you know about Old Testament sort of eschatology, the future things, it's kind of hazy. God's going to act. God's going to pay back. God's going to judge. God's going to save without specifying exactly what that's going to look like or where it's going to happen or the whole sort of future scheme of how it's going to unfold. But there is a lot in the Old Testament about God's ultimate response to the wicked, God's ultimate response to evil. The wicked shall be broken together, and those who forsake the Lord shall be consumed. The wicked will be like grass that sinks down into the flames. They will become dead bodies like refuse in the streets. The wicked will be as if burned to lime, like thorns cut down that are burned in the fire, lifeblood splattered on my garments. That in the day of vengeance, God trampled down the peoples in my anger, poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Those who forsake the Lord are destined to the sword. Not a symbol of torment, but a symbol of slaughter, a symbol of the sword causes you to end your life, to be killed. These are images of death, slaughter, the cessation of life, not ongoing torment. And these are just kind of general statements, but even when we go and look at even more specific statements about more specific, like these are on the day of the Lord, the day of judgment, like these are clearly kind of future when God returns to redeem Israel and judge the wicked. He will kill the wicked with the breath of his lips. The wicked will be slain by the Lord. The righteous will look upon the dead bodies of men who have rebelled against me. That's an important passage, Isaiah 66, because he goes on to talk about where the worm does not die and where the fire will not be quenched. And those are familiar images to Christians. Well, worm does not die, fire will not be quenched, just so you know, in the original context had to do with dead bodies. It's not an image of torment in its original context. And there's many other passages. One of the most, blatant is Malachi 4, the last book in the Old Testament. The day of the Lord will burn like a furnace. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be like stubble on the day that is coming. Will set them on fire. Not root or branch will be left to them. They will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act. Again, is this talking about hell? Is it not Sheol, whatever? It's like, well, those concepts weren't fully formed yet in the Old Testament. What was fully formed is God will return. He will put a final end to wickedness. He will judge the wicked, and this is what it will look like. And if we ask the question, is Malachi, if you sat Malachi down in the second row of a Baptist church and said, Malachi, what will the final state of the wicked be? Will it be ongoing torment, or will it be annihilation, or the end, or the cessation of life? He already answered it. I could let you figure that out. All these are images of death, slaughter, the cessation of life, not ongoing torment. And this provides the momentum, the language for the New Testament. When the New Testament does get a little more specific on what that final judgment will look like, the Old Testament, it's a little bit hazier, but it still provides the concepts, the momentum when we get to the New Testament. There's also many references to the future state of the wicked where they will be like Sodom. Now, throughout the story of Sodom, Sodom was a time when God destroyed the city of Sodom. And you see language of destruction. It's kind of dominant throughout the story of Sodom. And later Old Testament passages often refer to the fate, or they say the fate of the wicked will be like Sodom. What God did to Sodom, that's what's going to happen to the wicked. Like that's a very, very common way of talking about future judgment. Between the Testaments, or even in the New Testament, they also go back to the story of Sodom as this is an example of how God's going to judge the wicked. The picture again is one of total, final, irreversible destruction, not ongoing torment. I don't know any evidence in the Bible where Sodom is referred to as an example of torment. In the many passages that refer back to Sodom as an example of what's going to happen, it's a picture of, I almost said annihilation. I don't want to bias it, but a picture of destruction, the cessation of life. Fire is often used in the Old Testament, sometimes as a metaphor of refinement. Usually when I'm going to refine you like gold, usually metals, because if you put metal in a fire, it doesn't, it's not destroyed. It's usually cleaned up a bit. But more often it's used as a symbol of destruction. We already saw this in Malachi 4, but Psalm 21, Psalm 97, Malachi 4, just that second one there, fire goes before him and burns up his adversaries all around. Again, fire is not a symbol of future torment. Fire is a symbol of, in some cases, refinement. And again, my universalist friends will say, see, it's refinement. There's still something going on after. I would say more than often, though, it's a symbol of destruction, consuming. Like there's nothing that, there's no life, no consciousness, no conscious life after God judges with fire. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tough, okay? So, I want to go through this fast, but if you're not familiar with this part of the conversation, it might be a little hard to follow. But let me try to explain this as clearly, just because I don't want to lose anybody. So, I would say very boldly, if you just took the Old Testament, and you ask eternal conscious torment or annihilation, we would all be annihilationists. Like that wouldn't be a question. I shared a sampling of the verse. I could keep going more, but for the sake of time, I didn't share more. But this is the overwhelming picture. Final state of the wicked, annihilation. There is one verse in Daniel 12, 3, where it says the wicked will be raised to eternal contempt. But that's still not ongoing punishment. It's like the shame of being destroyed that lasts forever. Shame, humiliation is the point there. But beyond that one verse, which again, even that doesn't talk about eternal torment, the rest of the Old Testament is annihilation. So, but the question is, what does obviously the New Testament say? But before we ask that, we have to ask, what about the bridge between the testaments, namely what some people refer to as intertestamental Judaism or early Judaism, the 400 or so years of so-called silence, where you have all this Jewish literature, and you have Old Testament concepts that begin to be developed between the testaments. And this serves as a bridge to the New Testament. For example, the devil and demons. Name me an Old Testament passage where you see the devil and demons. Well, okay, maybe Genesis, although Genesis never says the snake was the devil. We know that from Revelation, but Second Chronicles, there's a reference, First Chronicles, there's a reference to maybe Satan, maybe Job 1, that's disputed. What about demons? Like there might be some stuff in Leviticus with Azazel, but really it's not. But then you get the New Testament, there's demons running all around, right? Well, that's because, it's not because they didn't exist, it's because between the testaments you have certain ideas and theological themes developed. And so when the New Testament comes along, the New Testament is written in that context. And so it too is interpreting the Old Testament, but it's in the world of some concepts being developed. So just because the Old Testament says destruction of the wicked doesn't necessarily mean the New Testament is going to go there. Because between the Testaments, we have two different perspectives that we can see. One, you have the destruction of the wicked, which is really the dominant view. I double-checked that over the last few weeks. And it's not that, some were eternal conscious torment, some were annihilationists. I would say the overwhelming perspective is annihilation. So the dominant trend of Judaism between the Testaments carries on the Old Testament tradition. But we do see some references in Judaism that start to talk about this more hell in terms of eternal torment. Okay? So the question is, which strand does the New Testament follow? Does it follow the Old Testament along with Judaism that correlates with the Old Testament? Or does it follow this perspective that was a view in Judaism, a minority view, and that's possible as well. We have to obviously look at the New Testament, but there's no reason to assume that the New Testament is going to simply endorse the eternal conscious torment view. In fact, if you were living in first century Palestine with this conversation without the New Testament written, with the Old Testament as your scriptures, you would probably assume destruction unless the New Testament demands otherwise. That's, I think, the right perspective to have. Does the New Testament follow the dominant strand of Judaism and obviously the comprehensive view of the Old Testament, or does it follow a Jewish view that was in the first century but wasn't the dominant view? And that's possible. I'm saying it's possible, but we shouldn't expect that. Now, I really got to skip ahead here. Let me just race through this fast. Rather than give you text after text after text, this would probably put everybody to sleep. I picked two Jewish bodies of literature that best overlap with the New Testament, in my opinion. Because some strands of Judaism between the Testaments were really far from New Testament thinking, and some were really close. And I think there's a body of literature called the Psalms of Solomon, unrelated to Solomon. Okay, it's written like 50 years before Jesus. But there's a decent chance that these came from Pharisaical circles, from the Pharisees. You say, wait a minute, Pharisees are bad people. It's like, well, they became kind of the bad people, but in this day and age, if you were living 50 or 100 years before Jesus, you hope you would have been a Pharisee. Like they were the good guys. They were the ones that followed the scriptures. They were resisting kind of Greek influence and everything, and they became kind of hypocritical by the first century. But they do, Paul was a Pharisee, right? And who believed in the resurrection? Well, Christians and the Pharisees, right? So there are commonalities in thought between Pharisees and the New Testament. The Psalms of Solomon also believe in the resurrection of the righteous. which is important because some Jewish doctrines don't really have any kind of afterlife belief. If you're familiar with like 1 Maccabees or the book of Baruch in the Apocrypha, like there's no afterlife view in these books. And so it's like to compare those with the New Testament is not that helpful. We need to take Jewish strands of Judaism that most overlap with New Testament thinking. A beautiful picture of a Davidic Messiah at the end of Psalms of Solomon. It says the Messiah is going to be sinless. It calls him Christ the Lord. I mean, it's very, very in tune with not in tune, but I mean, paves the way for some language in the New Testament. It's even found in an early, a really important manuscript of the Bible. It's some early Christians really like the Psalms of Solomon. Very clearly, throughout the Psalms of Solomon, it says that the righteous will be raised from the dead to eternal life, just like the New Testament. But when it talks about the fate of the wicked, it consistently uses language of death, destruction. They will no longer be found. The life of the righteous goes away forever, but sinners shall be taken, the life of the righteous, goes on forever, but the sinners shall be taken away to destruction. No memory of them will be found. Throughout, the righteous will be raised to everlasting life, while the wicked will be destroyed. This is a very common theme in the Psalms of Solomon. Even uses the Greek word apaleia, which is a very common word in the New Testament to refer to the destruction of the wicked. Probably the body of literature that most overlaps with the New Testament. If you're going to look at this bridge, this intertestamental bridge with the New Testament, I would say by far the Dead Sea Scrolls would be the kind of the first place to go. And I'm almost positive Dr. Evans will agree with me. I really hope he does, because he knows this stuff better than I do. But one of the, most significantly, the Dead Sea Scrolls, have you heard of like in the New Testament, it has an already not yet way of looking at the future? Kind of we are saved and we're being saved and we will be saved. Like it's kind of like we're kind of have one foot in the door of the kingdom, but the full kingdom will come later. It's an inaugurated eschatology. Well, that's pretty rare in Judaism, but the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to have that kind of, that already not yet way of thinking. There's a belief in the resurrection. It's a little ambiguous, but it seems to be there. Emphasis on the Spirit. A real low view of humanity, like we are mere mortals, and we need God's grace to save us. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls are fascinating. Like so many parallels with the New Testament. So it's and there's a whole lot of them, right? Tons of scrolls. So we can get a good picture. Okay, how did Jews that thought a lot like Christians, but not quite, how did they think about the fate of the wicked? Did they carry on the dominant view of the Old Testament, or did they kind of take this other view of eternal conscious torment? Well, I could have filled several slides here because I don't know what to make of this, but they love to talk about the fate of the wicked. The people who wrote these scrolls, they love to talk about how God's going to just smash and devour and destroy. These were the first hellfire brimstone. You thought Westboro Baptist was bad. These guys would have showed them up. The sword of the Lord will pounce in the era of judgment. All the sons of his truth will awaken to destroy the sons of wickedness, and they will no longer exist. This is the fourth reference there. All throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, they carry on everything I said about the Old Testament. The final destruction of the wicked is a pervasive theme in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it is, to my mind, looking at a lot of these texts, over the last few weeks especially, it's just destruction, 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 destruction. Even using some of the same words that the Old and New Testament uses. And this will become important for the end of my talk, which should be soon, but one of the themes in the Dead Sea Scrolls was that wicked Israel, lives under the curses of the covenant. You remember back in Deuteronomy 28, if you obey the law, you'll be blessed. If you disobey the law, you'll be cursed. And that's kind of a running theme throughout the Old Testament, the blessings and curses. And when the Old Testament closes, you get the impression that Israel still lives under the curse because they're still disobeying God. Even though they're back into the land, they're still kind of in exile. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is a major theme. Israel's still under the curse, but they believe they were the true Israel. and we have escaped that curse. Well, when they talked about the covenant curse, it wasn't just earthly, no rain for several weeks, or your cattle kind of croak and die, and your carrot farms, go kaput. They kind of talked about curse in language of like more afterlife, like final destruction of the wicked. Okay, so if you haven't escaped the curse of the covenant and followed the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls, then you're still under the curse, and that ultimately will lead to death and destruction. So when we get to, revisiting this thing here, this took me a long time to make too, by the way. I'm not very tech savvy, so I hope you're really enjoying this. This took, the colors, yeah. It's harder than it looks. This is like 3 hours of my time to do that, so I'm not going to rush through this. So when we look at, the expectation of the Old Testament, follow me, the expectation of the Old Testament is the final state of the wicked, death, destruction. Between the Testaments, the dominant view, especially in Jews whose way of thinking was similar to New Testament way of thinking, death and destruction, finality, irreversibility, cessation of life. We do have some references that started to intensify that to like eternal torment. But the death and destruction was the dominant view. So the question coming into the New Testament is, does the New Testament carry on? Does it carry on the Old Testament dominant view of intertestamental Judaism, or does it depart? And it could change or tweak some things. It could. I'm not saying that that's not possible, but I'm saying when we come to the New Testament, we shouldn't come with the assumption that it should say ECT. We should come with the assumption it should say destruction, death, unless it says otherwise. So what does the New Testament say? I don't at all intend for you to look these up, all of them, but again, I just want you to know that I have checked all these. I have bolded and underlined the ones that I think are really clear, and left unbolded and underlined the ones that could be subject to debate. Like, so these are Greek words that mean destruction, or the verb that means to kill, destroy. That second paragraph is where we get the John 3:16, that the whosoever shall not perish. That's the Greek word apolune. You see Matthew 10:29 there. Some of these, I was really generous to you guys. I just want you to know, some of the ones that, Chris is probably looking like, wow, you could have bolded that one. I'm like, I probably could have, but I just want to make sure that I'm not, 2 Thessalonians 2:3, the son of destruction. I didn't bold it. It's not, but son of destruction kind of means somebody who's destined to destruction. It could, but I don't want to. The other ones, to my mind, were really crystal clear. So far, again, if you were a first century Jew participating in ECT versus annihilation, you would say, okay, this is just very Old Testament language. This seems to carry on the tradition. In fact, if you were Isaiah sitting in the back row, you'd probably be yawning and falling asleep right now. You're like, well, yeah, of course. There's nothing abnormal about this. We also see other words that aren't the main words. Lathros and thanatos means death. And again, I've underlined and bolded ones that do seem to speak pretty clearly about the final fate of the wicked. Even words that convey things like disintegration or corrupt, to die or be killed. We see Jesus. This one, I don't know how I've read the Bible so long, and never, I don't want to say like you need to be an annihilationist, but at least rethink it a little bit. In light of what Jesus says, he compared the fate of the wicked to that of burned up chaff, trees, weeds, branch thrown into the fire. What happens in the natural meaning of the metaphor when weeds are thrown into the fire? Does it suffer forever, or does it burn up? A destroyed house, an uprooted plant, a chopped down tree. Son of Man will be like those who will be destroyed like in the flood, those who are burned up at Sodom. They will be like tenants who are ground to powder or cut into pieces. So again, just based on these metaphors, if you ask the question, do these more naturally convey some sense of ongoing torment, or do they naturally convey, even though they're metaphors, they're not to be taken in a strict literal sense, but they still convey something about the final state. So do they make more sense to convey torment forever, or do they make more sense to convey some sort of cessation of life? These are the words of Jesus. We have to ask that question and seriously answer it. The end of the wicked will be like the Galileans killed by Pilate, or those who were killed by the following of the tower. We also see Fire, again, if, throughout the New Testament to refer to the final state of the wicked. So does the fire imagery follow the Old Testament pattern of destruction? Or does it convey never-ending torment? We've already seen Matthew 3:12, Matthew 3:10, trees cut down, thrown into the fire, weeds pulled up, thrown into the fire. This is what it will be like at the end of the age, at the fiery judgment. God's indignation will consume, not torment, his enemies. We already saw that the phrase eternal fire could mean eternal torment, but the phrase itself doesn't demand that based on how it's used in the first century. So the New Testament follows the Old Testament pattern of fire highlighting destruction, consuming his enemies, not tormenting them forever. We also see references to the wicked will be like Sodom, images of fire, smoke, brimstone, and the uninhabitable wasteland left in the wake of God's destruction. The New Testament very much follows that same theme. Just like God wiped out the Sodomites, he will also do to the wicked. Put most explicitly in 2 Peter 2:6, this is just a very common way that Jews referred to the final state of the wicked. In reducing the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction. That's a Greek word used all throughout the Old Testament to refer to the destruction of Sodom. Making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. So if you ask Peter, what's the final state of the ungodly like? What's he going to say? I honestly don't know how you get torment out of it. I've seen people trying to wiggle out of it. The natural meaning of the verse, and this isn't an anomaly. This just fits right in with the flow of the Bible in the Old Testament and in myriad of passages that we've looked at. The picture is one of total, final, irreversible destruction, not eternal torment. I am short on time. I'm going to skip the big three. And just to put it into perspective, I'm not saying you need to believe this. I mean, everybody has to interpret the Bible on your own, but can we at least agree to not accuse annihilationists of not being biblical? I can't. I don't know if I can handle a form of evangelicalism that slings around the term unbiblical in this conversation the way it sometimes does. I get tagged on social media. I thought you used to be a Christian, kind of the John Stott thing. Or when did you deny the Bible? Seriously, sometimes it's my friends joking. They make a fake account. But sometimes they're real people. So that's all introduction to Galatians 3:13. Which is, once you have the flow of Scripture down, then Galatians 3:13 becomes, it's not terribly difficult to interpret, and I think it's really interesting how this applies to our conversation about the death of Christ and the final state of the wicked. This is honestly one of the most difficult passages in all of Paul to interpret. I spent part of I kid you not, I spent probably 6+ months on my dissertation on verse 12. Because it's really hard. The passage is kind of difficult, but the difficulty with the law, and if you obey the law, you curse. I thought obeying the law was a good thing. I thought that's how you escape the curse. And what's going on? Well, what does it mean to live by faith? And then why does he quote Leviticus here as the one who does these things shall live by them? It's just a hodgepodge. But the one thing that does seem really clear is that when he says Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, quotes Deuteronomy where it says, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. That Paul is entering into a very common first century conversation about the curse of the covenant. How do we escape the curse of the covenant? That was a live conversation. Remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls are like, well, you got to be part of our community. You got to interpret the Bible this way, and join our community. And then you're no longer under the covenant curse. Now you're into the covenant of life. And Paul enters into this conversation and says, no. Submitting to your interpretation in the community or trying to obey the law harder, that's not how you escape the curse. How you escape the curse is you submit to Jesus, the one who bore the curse. And throughout the Old Testament, we see curse language correlated with death. Summed up, this is a famous verse, Deuteronomy 30:19. I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. That means curse is death, death is curse. Life is blessing, blessing is life. And as this verse becomes interpreted later in the Old Testament and between the Testaments, life, this verse is seen as resurrection life. And the Qumran community saw the death, the curse, the ultimate curse of the covenant is destruction, final death. As far as I know, I don't know of a passage where the curses of the covenant are correlated with torment. There's one in 1 Enoch 27. That might come close, but it still seems to be cessation of life, where the curses of the covenant are no longer, your trees won't grow and your cattle are running off and, your wife's infertile or whatever, this earthly, it becomes this kind of like the final state, the final curse of humanity if you don't either follow the law or, in terms of Paul, follow Jesus, is final death and destruction, in line with everything we have said before. So, Christ redeems us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, namely by bearing the curse of the covenant. I believe in penal substitution. I think Chris will probably, I know he's going to agree, maybe even defend that. I'm a little hesitant, though, reading penal substitution through the lens of kind of medieval Christian way of thinking. I think we need to go back to the the biblical context and interpret curse of the covenant and penal substitution through a covenantal framework where Christ bore the curses that hangs over Israel because they failed. And Adam failed, and he was cursed. David failed, and he was cursed. And Solomon, and everybody fails. And so the curse is still there until the new Adam, the real Israel, comes and dies the death that we deserve. Because as Paul says elsewhere, the wages of sin is death. And Christ bore that covenant curse of death on the cross. Thank you.
Is this on now? Is this on now? You guys can hear me now? Okay. Thank you, Preston. I appreciate that. So we've got about 15 minutes, and if you will raise your hand, I'll bring a microphone to you and ask a question. Please, whatever side of this debate you land on, please do feel comfortable to ask a question. Nobody's going to bite, at least not too hard. But just do me a favor and ask a question and don't do a monologue like sometimes people do it. At events where they disagree with the speaker. So if you have a question that you'd like Preston to field, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you and we'll do this for about 15 minutes. Anybody?
Thank you. Dr. Sprinkle, I think?
Preston.
Thank you for everything you said. My question is, because the vast majority of the rest of evangelicalism adheres to the traditional view.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a growing movement for this view. So how do we, since you're part of the Gospel Coalition, how do you go about trying to get more people comfortable with this view within evangelicalism? How do we break through and make it more mainstream than it is?
Yeah, it's almost more of a psychological question. I'm not part of the Gospel Coalition, so that's not. The tradition is a big one for me. I'm a big fan of tradition, and that's why it's taken me several years to say, given the weight of tradition, I want to very cautiously, as I kept telling Chris, man, I need to dot every I and cross every T I can from the Bible before I really plant my stake here. So I want to respect that. I don't know if I have a lot of success stories. I just keep going back to the Bible. I mean, I'm going to go where the text leads. I hope I've cultivated that reputation. Doesn't mean my interpretation is always correct. Okay, I get that, but I think just promoting a very a robust biblical a series of biblical arguments for this view, and not for the view. I mean, I'm not here to defend a view. I'm here to understand what the Bible says. So really, I think give that impression. So for me, it's like I believe the Bible is truth. I'm going to try to tell the truth and as best as I can, and it's up to somebody else to believe that or not, or argue against it. If all of what I said is wrong, I need counter arguments and better interpretations. If there are, then I'll go with that where the text leads. I haven't seen it. I mean, again, I was telling Chris, you reread D.A. Carson's, who's 10 times more brilliant than I will ever be, his critique of annihilation. It's bewildering. I looked up 3 of the defenses of the traditional view, and I looked in the index. There's not a single citation of Malachi 4, the one that I brought up. There's just not dealing with stuff. They haven't looked at Qumran or done a really thorough word study on Apolumi and the stuff. They just say, well, I'm getting off track, and I don't want to get snarky. So stick to the text, make biblical arguments. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much, Preston. Appreciate your work. 2 quick questions. One, you say you prefer the term conditionalism, right? But we just talked about the Old Testament and the language of destroy and destruction and these kind of things, which seems to suggest that maybe annihilationism makes better sense, right? And then second question, and maybe this is beyond the scope or certainly the focus of this conference, but I listened to it and I just the whole thing, and I think to myself, who are the wicked?
Yeah.
And can we just equate Old Testament wicked with New Testament unbeliever, with my next door neighbor kind of thing? And I know that's not the focus of but I hear that and I just think, then who are the wicked?
That second one's that's a tough one. Let me answer the first one first. So the word, I'm fine with the language of annihilation. It's just sometimes traditionalists, and if you are one, it's awesome. It's just sometimes they hear annihilation, they say, well, wait a minute, we don't just poof out of existence. Like poof, that's not what destroy means, like disintegrate or no more material remains or whatever. And it's like, well, that's kind of, that's not what I mean by annihilation, but if that's what the word conveys to you, then that doesn't convey what I'm trying to say. Almost like using, conditionalism is the positive term that immortality is conditioned upon faith in Jesus Christ. So it doesn't speak directly to the actual fate of the wicked. So I wish there's a better term for the actual fate of the wicked. I almost just like to say destruction. Is it eternal torment or destruction? But then it's like, well, the Bible uses the term destruction. The debate is over what the term means. So I don't know if that would be fair. But cessation of life versus eternal torment. So it's the misunderstanding of the term annihilation why I have some hesitation. And is there I hate to give a short answer to a thick question on that second one, that the wicked between the Old Testament and New. I do think there are differences, and in a sense, just how we treat our enemies shifts from Old Testament to New, and even who the enemies are. It's almost like any Gentile outside the covenant is an enemy, and now Gentiles are included in the covenant, so there is some disagreement there. But still, you do have passages where those who, however you want to word it, reject God, don't submit to Jesus, whatever, will be judged in the end. I would still hold that, unless you're a universalist,
My name is Dan. I'm from Pennsylvania. Great job, by the way. When I approach people about this, I always try to mention John Stott so they don't attack me. Because, people refer to him as Christian. If we had a pope, you'd be the pope. So and sometimes I'll say, have you ever heard of Preston Sprinkle? Yeah. Francis Chan? Yeah. Are there any, I've been waiting 3 years for some big names to really come out and just really realize the powerful scriptural exegesis of this. And you got Richard Bachman, but just lay, for lay people. So
yeah, it's much more. I studied in the UK, and British evangelicals are more bent toward. Howard Marshall. Most of our seminary professors studied under Howard Marshall, and he, Richard Bachman. Honestly, hands down, I think most scholars would agree. Top 5 New Testament scholars out there. solid Christian. I mean, the guy's just rock solid. So in the British world, it's probably almost the dominant evangelical. I don't know, dominant, but it's. And yeah, I don't know, I've talked to people that are kind of closet annihilationists. I know people that they can't change their view. They would lose their job. They would, lose their wife because they lost their job. Their kids would be all confused. They would get kicked out of church. They'd be on the streets, literally, because we have a brand of evangelicalism that doesn't allow for that kind of thing. The school I was at, Eternal Bible College, this pumps me up. I came in one day and said, man, I think I'm leaning towards annihilation. And they had it in their doctrinal statement, eternal conscious torment. And we talked for a half hour. I kind of told them why and everything. They go, well, we're a Bible college, so we need to change our doctrinal statement. No, they didn't change. They said, well, we need to allow for it then, that you're clearly being biblical. We're a Bible college. We're teaching our students to think biblically. We don't want to tell them you must believe that. And they said, okay, well, we need to make room for this. But that is, I don't know any other school that's going to do that. So I think there's a lot of psychological pressures to prevent people from going there. I do know there's fairly well-known pastors. My friend John Mark Comer, he's a well-known pastor out in Portland, is an annihilationist. Bruxy Cavey is up in Canada. These aren't like John Piper status, but they're, they're out there. So, yeah, we do need more, though.
Give it time.
As far as getting the message out there, when you look at the New Testament, they brought the message to the Jews first. But then when, they have all their traditions and you still got to be circumcised. But then they went to the Gentiles. And so I'm wondering if there's a parallel with us going within the church, and would Rethinking Hell go outside to unbelievers, because it's still an important message for them.
Yeah. I mean, it is, the traditional view of hell is a major hindrance in evangelism. Now, to be clear, I've never and will never believe it because of that. I've never leaned towards this out of emotion. I've never leaned towards this because, well, it's easier to believe. I'm a Bible guy. I'm going to go where the text leads. But the byproduct, if it's biblical, the byproduct is there's a lot of people who are like, Christianity, Jesus, Christianity, yeah, but gosh, that eternal torment thing, I just can't. I can't go there. If there's a biblically credible option, it's kind of like my scientist friends. And this may divide the house, but whatever. When they find out that you don't have to be a young earth guy to embrace Christianity, that you can be a Christian and believe in an old earth, whatever, then like, okay, so I don't have to believe in a flat earth and young earth and all this stuff. Oh, okay, I can reconsider that. Now again, it's what does the Bible teach is the main question, but yes, there are evangelistic advantages moving forward if this view does have the biblical merit that I think it does.
Thank you. Kind of brass tacks here. If we're looking for more than just being right about the text, what do you think is the biggest gain in trying to move people into seeing conditional immortality or cessation of living? You're halfway there anyway. So what is really the biggest gain towards getting someone to look at it this way?
Good, yeah. I think in the church, I think one gain is we just want to have the right view of God. I do think, again, this is never a reason why I embrace annihilation and not ECT. If God wants to torment people forever and ever, he's God, I'm not. I'm okay with that. I really am, if that's what the text says. So it's not really a problem for me, but I know a lot of Christians who that is a major hang-up. When they think of God, love God, this, that, everything, Jesus, all of it, and they think, is he really going to keep people alive for billions of years because they were born into a Muslim family and didn't, the missionary handed the 15-year-old girl a tract and says, believe in Jesus, and she's like, no, okay, walks away, gets hit by a bus, and billions and billions and billions of years later, God's going to keep her alive so that she's not destroyed, so that she feels the worst pain. Like that says something about the character of God. And just so you know, I can worship that God if he revealed that character to me through the text. I am that given to the text. It's hard. I mean, it's like, I don't know what to do with that, but if my grandma told me, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, and that's been my posture. But for a lot of people, that is a major, major hang-up. So if that's not actually what the Bible teaches, then both inside the church and outside, I just talked to a guy. He was a missionary for 30 years, Bible college professor for another 20. And he says, Preston, this eternal conscious torment view of God has been the biggest hindrance in my faith. It affects my prayer life. It affects how I look at unbelievers. It affects my view of the church. If anything causes me to wrestle with my faith, it is that view. And so when he was following me and says, wait, you're saying this might not be the biblical view? I mean, it's been almost like, he's been a Christian for 60 years, and this has been like one of the most celebratory moments that he can follow the Bible and say this might not be what the Bible teaches about ECT. So.
Hi, Preston. My question is, what do you think about the flames? Do you think they're literal or not? And within that, what do you do with the so-called hell tourism of people who've claimed to have been there or seen visions, seen dreams, post-death experiences?
Right.
Kind of what do you do with that?
I don't think they're literal. I think they're images. I think most of the afterlife images are images being ground into powder. I mean, some pretty gruesome stuff. I think that we just don't know. I don't think we can really specify on the nature of the place. I don't, people have visions over all kinds of stuff. I don't, how do I say it? I can exegete the Bible. I don't know how to exegete somebody's story, some dream or whatever. And I'm not a denier. I'm a continuationist, charismatic with a small c. So maybe that happened, maybe it didn't, but I don't. If it happened and it doesn't match the Bible, then it's kind of like people, say, oh, I had a dream. I saw an angel and these big wings. And I said, well, the Bible never says angels have wings. So I'm not denying it, but it doesn't match what the Bible says. But cherubim have wings, seraphim have wings. The four living creatures have wings, but angeloi, angels never have wings in the Bible.
You mentioned Revelation 14 is
Yes.
kind of the most difficult. I agree with you on that. So the smoke of the torment going up forever, and then no rest day or night. Can you give a minute on that?
So several things. I'm okay with tensions too. So if that does teach torment, then I don't want to bend it into my view. But I will say a few things. One, the book of Revelation, apocalyptic language. I've read a lot of Jewish apocalyptic literature. It's over the top, excessive, over the top language. Like it's not, it's within the realm of interpretive possibilities, maybe even likelihood that using excessive language of our destruction is just the nature of apocalyptic language doesn't mean that that's to be taken literally. That's number one. Number two, as I learned at John MacArthur's seminary where I went, you don't begin with Revelation to build a doctrine and read everything in light of that. So even if that is the one, it's like, okay, I'll give that to you. And also, if you look at the context of Isaiah 34, verses 9 to 10, where he's clearly drawing on, Isaiah 34, 9 to 10, which has the language day and night, has torment or has smoke of their torment or smoke arising forever and ever, has all the linguistic ingredients, and yet Isaiah 34 is clearly destruction. So you add all that up, and it's like, at the very least, it doesn't have to mean eternal torment, even if we have maybe a little question mark behind it. There's other ways of reading it, especially when, I could put those, how many verses we have on annihilation. It seems like, well, we should go with the momentum and weight of Scripture and then read that. Yeah. But that is, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Yes, I have just a question about a Scripture. Psalm 139 and 8.
Yes.
It says, if I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. Mm-hmm. My question is, I guess from a traditionalist view, we're taught that hell is total separation from God. So what does the psalmist in that particular scripture, do you think, interprets, or what does it mean for us in the scope of what we're talking about here tonight?
Right. Specifically with the word Sheol there, right? Yeah, so Sheol is a fuzzy, it's a term in the Old Testament that is, it means different things depending on the context. Sometimes righteous people go to Sheol, and it just kind of means they died, they just went to the grave. Sometimes Sheol is specifically used to like where bad people go. The one thing that's, as far as I know, is universal is Sheol is always referring to what happens immediately after death, whereas the conversation about hell is not where do people go right when they die, because that's like the intermediate state. It's what happens when Jesus returns, raises the righteous and the wicked, face judgment, and then they go to hell. So Sheol is never parallel with hell, as far as I know in the old, yeah. And that's a bad translation. Yeah. It's if anything, it's talking about more the intermediate state before hell. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think about the clarity of the gospel being even more clear. You were talking about John 3:16 when you first had said you'd never thought about perish, meaning perish. And the first lie that was ever believed by Eve was what? You shall not surely die.
Right, yeah.
The New Age, the Eastern religions, reincarnation, that whole thing, and it's built within the Christian church many times because it came in through Tertullian. But to me, that's a key thing of this doctrine, because it means it wakes you up. I could die. I could cease to exist.
Yeah.
And to me, it makes John 3:16 just shake you up from that standpoint.
Yeah. Chris, you've done a good job saying that some people think annihilation is like softening it, but what's the greatest fear in the heart of humanity is death, capital punishment, that I would no longer exist. Like that. I think I might disagree with you a little. I would probably still rather than have that than never-ending torment. But I don't, the whole like saying, oh, you're just diminishing the justice of God, I don't think it's that at all. Like this is, the fear of never existing, I think is horrific, really. Yeah.
Can we please give Preston a round of applause?
Thank you.